A dying billionaire begs his virgin maid to spend one night with him because... Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. The rain had been falling since morning, steady and cold, washing over the sprawling Hale estate that sat at the edge of Connecticut's quiet countryside. Inside, every room glowed with soft amber light. Yet the mansion felt empty, like it had forgotten how to breathe. In the west wing, behind carved oak doors, lay Richard Hale, 38 years old, once known to the world as the steel-hearted billionaire of Westbridge. Now his body was thin, his hair touched with gray, and his heart was failing faster than the doctors dared to say aloud. Beside his bed, a young maid named Clara James folded a clean blanket with quiet precision. She had been with him for only 7 months, but in that time she had become the only voice that ever broke the silence in that house. Her hair was tied back neatly, her uniform simple, her eyes warm with an honesty that wealth could never imitate. She had no family, no home of her own, yet she moved through the mansion like sunlight through dust, gentle, unnoticed, but keeping everything alive. "Did you sleep at all, Mr. Hale?" she asked softly, adjusting his pillow. Richard smiled faintly. "Sleep feels like something people do when they still have time." His voice was calm, almost amused, but the blue veins beneath his skin told another story. The illness had taken nearly everything from him, his company, his strength, and soon his life. Yet every morning he insisted on being taken outside to the garden. Through the tall window, Clara could see it now. A stretch of roses, lavender, and small white daisies growing against the rain. It was the garden he had built with his own hands after stepping down from his empire. The world called it an act of madness. He called it peace. When she brought him his tea, she noticed the notebook on his lap. His handwriting, though shaky, still carried elegance. "What are you writing, sir?" she asked. He looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "A list of things I never said out loud. It is longer than I thought." Clara hesitated, then sat at the edge of his armchair. "Maybe you could tell someone. Sometimes saying it helps." Richard's gaze drifted to the rain streaking the window. And who would listen to a dying man who wasted his life chasing numbers? The words hung in the air, heavy and final. She wanted to answer, but before she could, he reached for a small pot of soil on the windowsill. A young rosebud was sprouting there, fragile, pale pink. He brushed his fingers across it with almost childlike care. "Plants do not judge," he said quietly. "They just grow if you give them time." That evening, after she had helped him to bed, he called her back just as she reached the door. "Clara," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. She turned. "Yes, Mr. Hale?" He hesitated, his eyes searching hers as if measuring her soul. "When I ask you something tonight, promise me you will listen before you decide." She frowned slightly but nodded. "Of course." The storm outside deepened. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied. In the dim light, Richard lay awake, his chest rising unevenly. Something unspoken trembled on his lips. Something that was not desire, not fear, but longing for the simplest thing he had never owned. Peace. And before the night ended, his request would change her life forever. That night, the storm pressed harder against the windows, the wind howling through the trees that lined the Hale estate. Inside, the fire in the study had almost burned out, leaving only a faint glow that danced across the walls. Clara moved quietly through the room, checking the clock. It was nearly midnight. Mr. Hale had refused to rest, asking instead for his chair to be moved closer to the window so he could watch the rain. When she entered, he was sitting there in his robe, a blanket across his knees, eyes fixed on the garden outside. The roses bent under the storm, yet somehow still held their color. His breathing was shallow, but his expression was calm, almost serene. "You should be in bed, Mr. Hale," she said gently, setting a tray of warm milk beside him. He smiled without looking away. "When you know your days are numbered, the night becomes the only time that feels real." Clara hesitated, then knelt beside his chair. "Do you want me to read to you?" He shook his head. "No, tonight I just want to talk, to tell someone the truth before it is too late." She folded her hands in her lap, waiting. The rain softened against the glass as he began to speak. "I spent my whole life building walls," he said slowly. walls made of steel, money, and silence. I thought if I stayed behind them, I would never be hurt again. But the truth is, loneliness hurts worse than anything. Clara's throat tightened. She had seen that pain before, in shelters, in hospitals, in herself. "You are not alone anymore," she said quietly. He turned his head toward her then, his eyes reflecting the soft light from the dying fire. "That is what I am afraid of losing." She reached out instinctively, resting her hand over his. His skin was cool, fragile, like paper that could tear if held too tightly. For a long moment they sat in silence, the sound of rain filling the space between their breaths. Then softly he said, "Clara, may I ask something that may sound strange?" She nodded. "You can ask anything. I do not want to die in a room full of machines. I do not want the last sound I hear to be a monitor beeping. I just want one night where I can forget that I am dying, where I can feel like I am still human. Would you stay with me?" His words fell heavy in the air, and for a moment she could not answer. The request was simple, but the meaning behind it trembled with sadness. She looked into his eyes and saw no lust, no hunger, only the desperate need for warmth, for presence, for proof that his life had meant something more than profit and loss. Clara swallowed hard. "If that is what you need, then I will stay." He nodded slowly, a faint breath of relief escaping him. "Thank you." She pulled the blanket higher around his shoulders and took the chair beside him. The clock ticked softly. Hours passed without words. Sometimes he would drift into light sleep, and she would keep watch, making sure he still breathed. Other times, he would whisper small pieces of memory: his mother's laughter, the smell of rain on asphalt, the first tree he ever planted. At one point, he looked toward the garden again and murmured, "Do you know what I regret most?" "What?" she asked. "That I waited until it was too late to care for something that could not give me a return." She did not know what to say, so she just took his hand again. It was trembling, but he smiled, closing his eyes. "You are kind, Clara. Do not let the world make you ashamed of that." Outside, the storm began to fade. Dawn crept over the horizon, pale and uncertain. The first light touched the wet petals of the roses, making them glisten like glass. Clara blinked away tears she had not realized were there. When she turned back to him, he was still, his chest barely rising. She leaned closer, listening. His voice came out as a whisper, almost fading into the wind. "You kept your promise," he said. "Thank you for staying." His hand grew still in hers. The fire had gone out, but the room felt strangely warm, as if peace itself had settled over it. Clara sat beside him until the sun rose completely, her fingers still holding his, her heart heavy yet calm. For the first time, she understood what he meant about one night feeling more real than an entire lifetime. The morning sun rose slowly over the Hale estate, spreading a thin veil of gold across the garden that Richard had tended with such care. The storm was gone, leaving the air fresh and still. Dew clung to the roses, each droplet shining like a small tear. Inside the mansion, Clara sat motionless in the chair beside him, her fingers still wrapped around his hand. His skin had grown cold. His chest no longer rose. The quiet was unbearable. For a long time she simply stared at him, unwilling to accept what her heart already knew. The clock on the wall ticked softly, counting the seconds of a world that had already moved on without him. When the nurse and the doctor arrived later that morning, Clara stood silently as they covered him with a white sheet. The doctor gave her a sympathetic look and said in a low voice, "He went peacefully." But peaceful was not how it felt. It felt hollow, as if the house itself had lost its heartbeat. After they left, she began to clean the room the way she always did, folding his blanket, setting his books in order. That was when she saw it the sealed envelope resting on the small writing desk. Her name was written across it in his steady, elegant handwriting, "To Clara James." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a short letter and a small brass key. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and rose oil, just like the room. "Clara, if you are reading this, I have already gone where no money or medicine can follow. I did not know how to thank you for what you gave me, the gift of dignity, of being seen as a man, not a patient. In the cabinet beneath this desk, you will find the rest of my confession, and what I hope will become something far greater than my own life. R.H." She placed the letter down and unlocked the cabinet with shaking hands. Inside were several folders and a thick document sealed in a leather binder. The first page read, "The Hale Foundation." Her eyes widened as she read the description. It was a legal trust, already signed and notarized, transferring nearly all of his remaining assets, over $400 million, to a charitable foundation dedicated to providing free heart surgeries for children from low-income families across the country. And beneath his signature, a line typed in bold: Founder and Honorary Chair, Clara James. She covered her mouth, tears streaming freely now. Her name, written there among all those legal words, felt unreal. She flipped to the last page and found another note written by hand. You once said that flowers bloom only when someone believes they still have time to care for them. I want you to care for lives, Clara, the way you cared for mine. Do not let this gift become a burden. Let it be your garden. Clara pressed the letter to her chest and sank to her knees. For a long moment she could not speak, could barely breathe. Outside, the morning light fell across the rose garden, turning every petal into fire. Days passed in a blur of lawyers, reporters, and board members arriving at the estate. They all spoke to her with polite awe, calling her Miss James, asking her to stand for photographs she did not want. Through it all, she remained quiet, her heart still anchored to that night by the window. One evening, she walked back to the garden alone. The soil was still damp from the storm, and the air smelled of lavender. She found the small rosebud that Richard had touched only a day before he died. It had bloomed completely, soft and pink and alive. She knelt beside it and whispered, "You kept growing, just like he said you would." In the days that followed, she oversaw the paperwork and the first transfer of funds. The Hale Heart Foundation opened its first branch in Boston within 3 months. Photos of smiling children and families began to fill the news. For each surgery approved, she made sure a small rose was placed in the recovery room. She wanted them to remember that life itself could still bloom even after storms. On the evening of the dedication ceremony, Clara stood behind the podium, wearing a simple cream dress. The cameras flashed, and she spoke with a calm strength that surprised even herself. "Richard Hale once told me that kindness outlives wealth," she said softly. "He believed that every heart, no matter how broken, can still heal another. This foundation is not about his death. It is about his life and the lives we can still save." As she stepped down, she looked toward the back of the hall, where a large framed photograph of Richard stood beside a vase of roses from his garden. For a moment she could almost feel his presence, steady, quiet, proud. When she returned to the mansion that night, the house did not feel empty anymore. The garden shimmered under the moonlight, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. She smiled through her tears and whispered into the quiet, "You found your peace, Richard. Now I will keep it alive." The wind rustled the roses, carrying their fragrance across the open air, as if the garden itself was answering her back. Months passed quietly after the opening of the Hale Heart Foundation. Winter turned to spring, and every week brought letters and photographs from hospitals across the country. Children with bright eyes and bandaged chests smiled beside their doctors. Families wrote words of gratitude that Clara could hardly bear to read without tears. Each envelope felt like a heartbeat returning to the man who had once thought his heart was beyond saving. Clara kept her promise to him. She still lived in the Hale estate, though now it had been turned into the headquarters of the foundation. The once silent halls were filled with soft voices, footsteps, and the hum of computers. But even with people coming and going, the house never lost its peace. The garden outside remained untouched, exactly as Richard had left it. Every morning before work, Clara would water the roses and touch the small plaque he had ordered before his death. It read, "For every heart that learns to love again." Sometimes she would sit on the bench beside the pond, watching the reflection of the sky ripple over the water. It was in those quiet moments that she still felt him most, his calm voice, his tired but gentle smile, his belief that kindness could outlast any empire. One afternoon, as she sorted through a pile of donation letters in the study, she found a familiar handwriting on a small envelope. It was from one of Richard's oldest associates, Mr. Turner, a man who had handled his business affairs for years. Inside was a handwritten note. "Miss James, I believe Mr. Hale intended for you to have this. He gave it to me months before he passed, asking that it be delivered once the foundation was running. I hope it brings you peace." Beneath the letter was a small wooden box. Clara opened it carefully. Inside lay a silver pendant shaped like a heart, its surface engraved with the image of a blooming rose. Alongside it was a folded sheet of paper, written in Richard's steady hand. "Clara, if this reaches you, it means you have kept your promise, and I knew you would. I once thought money could measure worth, but you showed me that kindness measures life. Keep this close, not as a gift, but as a reminder that love does not end when breath does. It grows wherever it is tended. Her tears fell silently onto the page. She clasped the pendant in her hand and whispered, "I will not let it fade, Richard." That evening, she attended a board meeting in the city. The foundation had grown faster than anyone expected. There were now partnerships forming with hospitals in Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles. Some of the board members spoke about expanding internationally, but Clara remained focused on the mission. "Our goal is not to grow richer," she said calmly. "It is to make sure no child is left waiting because their family cannot afford a heartbeat." When the meeting ended, several doctors and donors approached to thank her personally. One of them, a young surgeon named Dr. Lewis, smiled warmly. "Your foundation has saved more lives in a year than some hospitals manage in a decade," he said. "You must have had quite an inspiration." Clara paused, then replied softly, "Yes, someone who taught me that compassion is the truest form of wealth." Later that night, she returned home exhausted but content. The house was quiet again, just as it had been in those early days. She lit a candle and walked through the garden, the moonlight spreading across the petals like liquid silver. She stopped by the rosebush that had bloomed the morning after he died. It had grown stronger, taller, its roots deep in the soil. Gently, she hung the silver pendant on one of its branches. The metal caught the moonlight and shimmered faintly. "Good night, Richard," she whispered. "You are still here, in every life you helped me touch." The wind brushed through the garden, stirring the leaves, almost like a sigh of acknowledgement. Weeks later, during the Foundation's first annual gala, Clara stood before a crowd of hundreds. Behind her, on a large screen, photographs of the children helped by the fund appeared one by one. She told Richard's story, not the billionaire's success, but the man who planted roses when his heart was failing, who chose to give everything away when he had nothing left to gain. The audience was silent as she ended her speech with the same words he had once told her. "Kindness outlives wealth, always." As the crowd rose in applause, Clara looked upward, her heart full yet light. Somewhere beyond the glittering lights and the music, she felt him again, steady, calm, eternal. That night, when she returned to the mansion, the garden seemed alive with color. Dozens of roses had bloomed overnight, their petals open wide as if the earth itself was smiling. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath of the fragrant air. Peace, she realized, was not the absence of pain. It was the quiet knowing that love, real love, never ends. And in that moment, beneath the stars and the soft whisper of wind through the roses, Clara understood that Richard Hale's heart had never truly stopped beating. It was alive in every life saved, in every child's laughter, and in her own steady breath. A full year had passed since Richard Hale's death, yet the world he left behind continued to grow in ways he never could have imagined. The Hale Heart Foundation had become a symbol of hope across the nation. Hospitals proudly displayed the silver rose emblem he had designed, and every week more children received a second chance at life. News anchors called it the miracle born from a dying man's kindness. For Clara, each new success was both joy and ache. She had become the face of the foundation, but she never allowed her name to overshadow his. She insisted that every press release, every event, every banner, carry his words, "Kindness outlives wealth." Despite her new position and the respect she earned, Clara never left the Hale estate. The mansion had become a sanctuary, a place where she could still feel his presence. Each morning she would brew a pot of tea, open the windows to the garden, and read the letters from families who had been helped. Some sent photos of children playing soccer again. Others drew small pictures of hearts surrounded by flowers. She kept them all in a wooden box labeled "The Garden Lives." One gray morning in early spring, as she was reviewing financial reports in the study, she heard a knock on the door. A courier stood outside holding a small parcel. "Delivery for Miss James," he said. Inside the box was an old journal bound in dark leather. There was no note, only a tag that read, "Property of R. Hale." Clara's hands shook as she opened it. The first page was dated 5 years earlier, long before he had fallen ill. "I have more money than I can count, yet I cannot sleep. Every deal feels like another chain. I built an empire, but I do not remember why. Perhaps one day I will plant something that grows without profit." She turned the pages slowly, reading his private thoughts. The entries chronicled his transformation from a man obsessed with control to one who sought meaning. Then, near the end, she found a passage written just a month before his diagnosis. "If I ever meet someone who treats me as a man and not a name, I will give her everything I have. Not because she earns it, but because she reminds me what it means to be alive. Clara closed the journal, tears welling in her eyes. She pressed her palm against the cover and whispered, "You kept your promise, Richard, and I will keep mine." Later that day, she visited the Foundation's newest clinic in New York City. The walls were painted a soft shade of blue, and the children's laughter echoed through the halls. She walked past rooms where tiny hearts beat steady again because of surgeries funded by his fortune. One boy ran up to her holding a stick figure of a man watering flowers. "This is Mr. Hale," the boy said proudly. "My mom said he helped fix my heart." Clara smiled, kneeling to his height. "He did, sweetheart, and he would be very proud of you." That night, back at the mansion, she sat in the garden with the silver pendant resting in her palm. The moonlight fell over the roses, just as it had the night he died. She closed her eyes, feeling the cool breeze brush against her face. "You see, Richard," she said softly, "your garden never stopped growing. It just changed shape. Now it blooms in every child you saved." A soft wind stirred the petals, and she could almost hear his voice again, calm, warm, filled with gratitude. Months later, during the anniversary gala of the Hale Heart Foundation, Clara stood before hundreds of guests. Doctors, donors, and families filled the grand hall. The air buzzed with admiration, but when she spoke, her voice remained humble and tender. 1 year ago, a man with a failing heart chose to give life to others. He was not perfect, but he was brave enough to love beyond himself. Today, his garden has spread across this country, touching thousands of hearts. Every one of you here is part of that garden. The crowd rose in applause, many wiping tears. Behind her, on a large screen, a slideshow displayed the words of his final letter, ending with the line, "Love does not end when breath does. It grows wherever it is tended." As the music swelled, Clara stepped down from the stage and walked outside onto the balcony. Below, the city glimmered like a field of stars. She took a deep breath of the cool night air, feeling a peace she had never known before. "Thank you," she whispered into the wind. "You gave me a purpose, and I will carry it for the rest of my life." In the distance, thunder rumbled softly, followed by rain, the same kind of rain that had once fallen on the night they first spoke. She lifted her face to the sky, letting the drops fall freely, and for a fleeting moment, she could almost see him in the reflection of the wet glass doors, smiling, alive, and at peace. Clara smiled back, her heart steady and full. The rain continued to fall over the garden, feeding the roses that would never stop blooming. Weeks after the gala, spring had settled gently over Connecticut. The Hale estate looked alive again, surrounded by the same blossoms Richard had once planted with trembling hands. Every morning, Clara still followed her quiet ritual, brewing tea, walking through the garden, touching the plaque engraved with his words, "For every heart that learns to love again." Life had grown fuller, but it never lost the weight of memory. Each day brought new responsibilities, new families reaching out for help, new stories of survival. Yet every night, when the lights in the Foundation's offices dimmed, Clara would sit by the window and read one letter from the wooden box she called "The Garden Lives." Those letters reminded her why she continued. One morning, a thick envelope arrived with a red stamp from the Department of Health. Inside was an invitation for the Hale Heart Foundation to expand into rural hospitals across the Midwest. The program promised to bring life-saving surgeries to children who had never seen a modern clinic. Clara smiled through tears. "He would have loved this," she whispered. Later that week, she drove to Boston to meet with the board of directors. The highway stretched ahead under a soft mist, and for a moment she remembered the first time she had ridden in Richard's car to the hospital. Back then, she was only a maid. Now, she was leading one of the most respected charitable organizations in the country. Yet in her heart, she still felt like the girl who had sat beside him in silence, listening to the rain. The meeting went smoothly. The board approved the new expansion unanimously. As she signed the final papers, one of the younger members said, "Miss James, you have turned his dream into a movement." Clara smiled gently. "No," she replied, "he turned mine into one." That evening, she returned to the estate just before sunset. The garden glowed gold under the fading light, every flower seeming to lean toward her as she walked. She stopped by the same bench where Richard had once rested his weary heart. On the seat lay something unexpected, a small envelope, yellowed by time. It had been tucked beneath the wood. Inside was a single page torn from his old journal. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. If the garden ever grows beyond these walls, it means I did not plant in vain. To whoever finds this, remember, love does not end. It simply changes its shape. Clara pressed the page to her chest, her eyes glistening. She looked up at the sky, now streaked with pink and lavender, and whispered, "It has grown, Richard. It has grown farther than you could have dreamed." The wind rustled through the roses, scattering a few petals at her feet. She picked one up and smiled. "You once told me that flowers bloom when someone believes they still have time to care. I still believe, Richard, and I will keep caring." As night fell, lights flickered on across the mansion. The estate no longer felt lonely. Laughter echoed from the offices inside, where volunteers worked late on the next round of surgeries. Clara lingered in the garden a moment longer, breathing in the scent of roses before turning back toward the house. Above her, the stars began to appear soft, steady, endless. And in their light, the Hale estate stood not as a monument to loss, but as proof that compassion can outlive even the hands that first planted it. Clara smiled one last time before whispering, "Good night, Richard. The garden is safe." And with that, she walked inside, leaving the roses swaying gently under the moonlight, alive with every heartbeat they had both given away. Months turned into another year, and the Hale Heart Foundation had become a national beacon of compassion. New hospitals carried the silver rose emblem, and Clara's name appeared in magazines and on television, though she never grew used to the attention. To her, every story was not about fame, but about the lives Richard's legacy continued to touch. Still, there were nights when the weight of it all pressed on her shoulders. The paperwork, the travel, the endless demands, it sometimes felt like too much for one person. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she sat alone in the study with only the ticking of the clock for company. Her tea had gone cold, and a stack of files waited beside her. She stared at them but could not bring herself to move. For the first time in years, she felt the same exhaustion she had seen in Richard's eyes when he used to stare out the window. The thought frightened her. She rose and walked into the garden, needing air. The night was cool, the sky painted deep indigo. The roses glowed faintly in the moonlight, and the wind carried their scent. Clara sat on the old bench, folded her hands, and whispered, "I miss your calm, Richard. Sometimes I feel like I am losing the balance you taught me." As if in answer, a soft breeze stirred the trees, shaking loose a few petals that drifted onto her lap. She smiled sadly. "You would tell me to rest," she said quietly, "to stop measuring my worth by how much I give." A rustle behind her made her turn. One of the volunteers from the foundation, a young woman named Megan, stood hesitantly at the edge of the garden. "Miss James," she said gently, "I did not mean to interrupt. The team wanted to check if you are all right." "You have not left your desk all day." Clara exhaled, nodding. "Thank you, Megan. I am fine. Just thinking." Megan smiled softly. "You know, every time I walk past this garden, I feel peaceful." Mr. Hale must have been a remarkable man. Clara looked toward the roses. "He was," she said. But what made him remarkable was not his money. It was the moment he chose to stop being afraid of love. The volunteer nodded, then quietly returned to the house, leaving Clara alone again under the stars. She stayed there for a long time, watching the moon climb higher. Eventually she rose, brushing the petals from her lap, and looked at the silver pendant still hanging from the rosebush. "Maybe peace is not a destination," she murmured. "Maybe it is just remembering who taught you to see beauty again." A few days later, the foundation hosted a new event, a blood donation drive and health fair for families who could not afford care. The community turnout was overwhelming. Dozens of volunteers worked tirelessly, and Clara watched them with pride. She could feel Richard's influence everywhere, in every act of kindness, every smile, every word of encouragement. When the event ended, a little girl ran up to her, clutching a rose from the booth. "This is for you, Miss Clara," the child said brightly. "Mommy says you help people the way angels do." Clara knelt and accepted the flower, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, sweetheart. But the truth is, I am only continuing what someone else started." As the child ran back to her mother, Clara looked toward the horizon where the sun was setting in shades of pink and gold. The light poured across the garden, illuminating the plaque with Richard's words. For the first time, she realized they no longer made her ache. They made her smile. That evening, as the foundation staff gathered for dinner, Clara raised her glass and said softly, "To every heart that learns to love again, may we never stop." The room echoed with a quiet, heartfelt cheer. and outside, the garden swayed in the twilight, as if the earth itself was still listening. The following spring, the Hale Heart Foundation prepared for its most ambitious project yet, a nationwide children's heart screening program. It was the kind of vision Richard had once dreamed about but never lived to see. Under Clara's leadership, the idea had become reality. As the program launched, Clara traveled across the country visiting clinics, speaking with families, and meeting the doctors who made it all possible. Every time she walked through a hospital corridor and saw the silver rose emblem, she felt a quiet pride. It reminded her that a single act of kindness could grow roots deeper than anyone imagined. One afternoon, while visiting a new hospital in Denver, she stepped into a recovery room where a boy was drawing on the whiteboard. He looked up and grinned. "Are you the lady from the picture in the hallway?" he asked. Clara laughed softly. "I might be. What are you drawing?" He turned the board around. It was a heart made of flowers. "Mom says they fixed my heart, so I am making it pretty again." The simplicity of his words struck her. She knelt beside him and said, "It already is pretty, sweetheart. You just needed someone to remind you how strong it is." Later that evening, Clara stood outside the hospital watching the sunset paint the mountains orange. For a moment, the quiet filled her completely. She thought of Richard, the way his voice had softened when he spoke of second chances, the way his garden had mirrored his healing heart. When she returned to the Hale estate a week later, spring had burst across the property. The roses had climbed higher than ever, wrapping around the stone columns and spilling over the fences. It was as if the earth itself was celebrating. She walked slowly through the garden, letting her fingers brush the petals, and stopped at the bench where his final letter had once been found. "Richard," she whispered, "I saw it today, the proof that your gift is still saving lives. You are still here, in every heartbeat, in every smile." The air carried the faint hum of bees and the soft rustle of leaves. The garden seemed to breathe with her words. Inside the house, a new letter from the National Health Board awaited her. It confirmed that the Hale Heart Foundation had been nominated for a humanitarian award. Clara smiled as she read it, but set the letter aside. Honors and recognition were never the reason she stayed. The real reward was the life she could feel growing all around her. That night, she sat by the window, overlooking the moonlit garden. The wind whispered through the roses, and for the first time she did not feel like she was speaking to his memory. She felt like he was there, part of every living thing that continued to bloom. And as she drifted to sleep, the words from his last letter echoed in her mind. "Love does not end when breath does. It grows wherever it is tended." A year later, on the anniversary of the foundation's creation, the Hale estate was filled with people once more. Doctors, volunteers, and dozens of families whose children had been saved gathered in the garden that had started it all. The roses were in full bloom, their scent sweet and warm under the afternoon sun. Clara stood by the old stone fountain, wearing a simple ivory dress and holding a single white rose. Behind her, the mansion doors were open wide, revealing banners that read, "The Hale Heart Foundation, 5,000 Hearts Healed." Soft music played in the background as laughter and conversation drifted through the air. It was not a grand ceremony, it was a celebration of life, exactly as Richard would have wanted. When the music quieted, Clara stepped forward to speak. Her voice was steady, calm, but full of emotion. 5,000 lives, she began. 5,000 heartbeats that continue because one man believed that kindness could outlive him. Richard Hale once told me that flowers bloom only when someone still believes they have time to care. Today I see proof of that everywhere I look. Applause filled the garden. Some parents wiped tears from their eyes. Children ran between the rose bushes, their laughter echoing like the melody of something eternal. After the crowd dispersed, Clara remained behind, standing by the plaque at the center of the garden. The letters shimmered in the golden light. "For every heart that learns to love again." She knelt and placed the white rose beside it. "Richard," she whispered, "your garden is still growing." The wind stirred softly, brushing through the leaves. For a moment it felt as if the air itself had answered her. She closed her eyes, hearing his voice again, the calm tone that had once filled this very space. "Do not mourn me, Clara, just keep planting." She smiled through her tears, whispering, "I already have." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the garden glowed with shades of amber and rose. The children's laughter faded into the sound of the evening breeze, and the estate stood quiet once more, but no longer lonely. It had become a living monument, a place where compassion had taken root and flourished. Inside the house, on the desk where Richard used to write, sat the silver pendant she once hung on the rosebush. The light from the window caught it, scattering reflections across the room like tiny stars. And in that glow, Clara felt a peace deeper than grief, a certainty that love, once given, never dies. It only changes form, growing from heart to heart, forever blooming in those who choose to care. The camera of memory would fade on the garden now in full bloom, and on the quiet smile of the woman who had turned one man's final wish into a lifetime of healing.